Before I get started, first of all, I want to recognize one more person, which is Amanda Urians to my left, because she has jumped into planning this thing with both feet and has done amazing work. I was nominally her partner in all of this, but she would not let me help. So please give Amanda a round of applause because this truly did not happen. So Amanda told me that, so we have 10 minutes for these talks, and Amanda told me that the headings begin at 12. So I'm going to talk very fast. The first thing I want to do is something of a disclaimer. My remarks here today are something I'm somewhat uncomfortable with because they, and I suspect a lot of what you're going to hear this week, are going to lay a lot of blame at the feet of elites, particularly within the Republican Party, for things that are going on right now. Because of the discipline I covered, this is uncomfortable territory for me. I usually try to remain as neutral in my public face as the facts will allow. So I need to briefly address why I feel like this is a necessary thing to do. And I guess the first thing to say, and I hope this is obvious, but let me say it anyway, neither Republicans nor Democrats, of course, have any law on a devotion to fact or truth, nor a desire to maintain the rule of law. There is nothing inherent in conservatism or liberalism that would lead you to either of those positions. There's certainly been times in our history when threats to democracy have come from the left, and it harms the credibility of liberals when they act as if the issues that are facing us are somehow endemic or the endpoint of conservatism rather than being rooted in human psychology and the circumstances of history. That said, the moment we find ourselves in right now involves clear truth and clear falsehood, and most elites, not all, but most elites within the Republican Party have chosen to side with falsehood, or at least to remain quiet in the face of those who are speaking out on behalf of falsehood. And we need to deal with the world as it is, not the world that would make us comfortable. So, with that out of the way, why are we here? From a political perspective, we are here because there is a fairly large group of Americans who believe that American democracy has been imperiled, and ironically, the very attempts they are using to save it are actually the thing that is endangering it. They have been conned into believing a thing that has been dubbed the big lie. The 2020 election was stolen. That belief, that false belief, is justifying their actions rewriting election laws in ways that push us in an authoritarian direction. So, as I count, that last statement has 3 claims in it, so I need to back up all of it. Claim 1, that the big lie is a lie. Claim 2, that it is justifying actions rewriting election laws. And claim 3, that this is somehow authoritarian. So first, how do we know that this lie is in fact a lie? Well, we know from several sources that Trump had a plan to claim election fraud if he wasn't obviously winning on election night. He talked repeatedly about the election being rigged months before there was ever an election, where he couldn't possibly have known what was going to happen. And he told people around him that he was going to declare a victory on election night, kind of no matter what happened. So it's not really surprising that when election night happened, he did exactly what he said he was going to do. And part of that claim was to say, well, because the numbers look wrong because Biden rigged the election. He has never provided any evidence to substantiate this claim, nor has any evidence ever surfaced in the 2 years since. His own cyber election czar said that 2020 was the, quote, most secure election in American history. And his own attorney general looked into these claims of election rigging and told the president to his face that they were, and again I'm quoting here, bullshit. So, none of that, unfortunately, has stopped Trump from claiming the election was rigged, even actually down to this day, even though he still hasn't produced any evidence of this extraordinary claim. But it was the basis in that post-election period for a series of measures he took trying to overturn the election, whether that was by setting up fraudulent slates of electors to confuse the ceremonial vote count in Congress on January 6th, whether that was pressuring state election officials to find votes to overturn the elections in their states, or what's maybe the most cynical thing of all, calling his supporters to DC, giving a big speech to rile them up, pointing them at Congress, and then doing nothing for 3 hours while the riot happened, the Capitol Police were overrun, legislators' lives were endangered, and 5 people died. Our institutions held despite all of that, which is a relief. And it's worth saying that our institutions held in this period only due to the bravery of a number of elected officials. Some of them you know, some of them you don't. But those include a fair number of Republicans who put their careers on the line to stand up for the integrity of the system and the idea that facts matter. And some of those people no longer have offices as a result of doing this. If we're going to call out those within the GOP who are behaving badly right now, we need to also recognize that those people who stood up in the face of overwhelming pressure, there are no braver patriots among us. That said, his base believed him. Even now, roughly 70% of Republican voters believe that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president of the United States. And it is this false belief that has been the engine that has turned this into a story that is larger than any one election. So, I think with part 2, that belief has fueled a push to weaken election infrastructure in this country through a number of mechanisms, but let me just focus on 3 of them. Voting restrictions, changes to election administration, and acolytes of the big lie running to oversee elections themselves. In the 2 years since the election, 19 states have passed restrictions on voting. 17 of those 19 states are controlled by Republicans. I need to say that so that I can say both that this is not entirely a Republican phenomenon, and also to say that it is overwhelmingly a Republican phenomenon. Those laws include, for instance, a law in Georgia that makes it illegal to give food or water to people standing in line to vote, when everyone sort of understands that lines tend to build up in areas primarily that are foreign black. And it includes a law in Florida that deputizes a brand new police force to find election fraud that has now gone out and started arresting people. But so far, the only people they can find to arrest are people who were told by state officials that they were legitimate to vote. So these are people who were told they could vote, who voted in good faith, and have now been fraud marched out of their places of employment or out of their houses and treated like criminals because they did a thing that people in power told them that they were allowed to do. So, one other thing. Also, in many places around the country, candidates are on the ballot for usually neutral jobs running elections on an explicit platform that the big lie was not a lie. That includes 7 races for secretaries of state, which are the chief election officials in most states. So all of this is very dramatic and hopefully scary, but how is it authoritarian? Well, there's a book by 2 political scientists named Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt called How Democracies Die. And they suggest that if you want your democracy to survive, everyone involved needs to display 2 things, what they call mutual toleration. That is to say, we all need to recognize that the opposition also has a right to be there if they win elections, and forbearance, that we should not push our legal power to its maximum extent. When we ignore these limits, we do make it easier for our side to win, but even as our opponents are losing, the bigger loser is actually the system, because playing what they call constitutional hardball encourages our opponents to play that game as well, was it? And the tit for tat there ultimately results in the death of democracy. Or perhaps our opponents understand what we're doing, but believe in democracy and resist that temptation. Well, that emboldens us, allows us to take more and more ground, and that can kill democracy too. So even if we have the power to do something under the letter of the law, it is important that we restrain ourselves from doing it if it violates the spirit of democracy. But that is exactly what these new laws and these candidates represent. They are a ratcheting up of this game of constitutional hardball at the expense of democratic openness. So what can we do about all this? First, I would argue that if you are a Republican, you have a special obligation. Given the way our politics is right now, most conservatives are not going to listen to an ivory tower academic going ahead in an intellectual life. But you have the credibility You can tell your co-partisans that they are being lied to, and you can show them what's real and what's not. But if you're not a conservative, you are not off the hook. There's a 1948 essay by Robert Merton and Paul Lazarsfeld, sociologists, in which they describe a citizen who, quote, comes to the state knowing about the problems of the day or doing something about them. Just attending this talk, feeling your blood pressure rise, maybe putting something on social media, right? That's not enough. We have to be loud about this. In particular, here is one concrete thing you can do. Call your member of Congress and tell him or her to pass the bipartisan reforms of the Electoral Count Act. That would close a lot of the loopholes that the worst actors in American politics are planning on exploiting in 2024. And finally, and I promise this is the last thing, please don't go ahead of me. We should all recognize that whatever our politics, if you are liberal, if you are conservative, if you're somewhere in between, we are all one when it comes to this fight. There are people who are trying to break democracy, and they are united and methodical in how they are going about doing it. And if we want to beat them, we have to be united and methodical as well. So if you believe that all American citizens should have free and fair access to the polls, if you believe that votes should be counted fairly and neutrally, you are my ally in this, even if we disagree on every substantive issue. Because if we don't get this right, substantive issues don't matter. There is time to save our system, but only just and only if all people of goodwill work together to make it happen. And I don't know if that was 10 minutes or not.